Before today's video starts, I just want to bring you a quick word from our sponsor, Vikings War of Clans. Vikings War of Clans is an incredibly fun browser game that is easy to get into. I've been playing Vikings on my browser for 2 months and I'm addicted to playing it. Vikings has fantastic graphics and incredibly immersive gameplay. Amazingly, even though the game has stunning graphics, you don't have to download it. You can just play it on your browser. Vikings is amazing to play on a big screen. In the game, you can join clans, and then you get to work together with players from all over the world. Vikings is a high quality game, and it's absolutely free to play. It's also fast and easy to register. Join Vikings for free by clicking on my link in the description box below and get a cool bonus of 200 gold coins to kickstart your game. So please check out Vikings War of Clans today, because I know you'll enjoy the game and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed. Number 3. Ellen Elfstrom. Ellen Higgins was born in March 1924 on Staten Island, New York, to parents who were Irish immigrants. Elfstrom had 10 siblings. One day, when she was in her early 20s, she was riding the bus and she met a young man who was wearing a soldier uniform. His name was Donald Elfstrom. They started talking, and it turned out that they lived 2 streets from each other. They began dating, and it wasn't long before they were engaged. While they were engaged, Ellen was involved in a horrible accident. She was struck by a car and dragged 200 feet. She survived, but she was partially disabled. In October 1947, Ellen and Donald got married. In 1951, they moved to East Brunswick, New Jersey. For a couple years, Ellen worked as a secretary for the South Brunswick School District. Then she gave birth to a son and became a stay-at-home mom. Ellen and Donald went on to have 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. In 1980, Ellen and Donald got divorced. 5 years later, Ellen applied for disability because she had back problems stemming from the time she was hit by the car. Then over the next several decades, Ellen suffered several personal tragedies. Her son Bruce died in 1991. 5 years later, her ex-husband died. Then in 2007, her other son, Dennis, passed away. By the time Dennis died, Ellen was leaving the house very little. She also rarely let people inside her home. She had neighbors cash her disability checks and give her the money. Every day, a diner would deliver a buttered roll and a cup of coffee. That is all she ate every day. Over the years, Ellen's house became more and more run down. Eventually, the hydro and the water were shut off. The house was also full of debris. Ellen supposedly booby-trapped the house by piling items in front of the windows. In late 2008, Ellen's neighbors stopped seeing her. 6 months later, in late April 2009, one of Ellen's neighbors noticed that her mail had not been collected for several days. The neighbor called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. When the police arrived at Ellen's home, they found the front and back doors locked. They managed to get into the house, but because of all the debris in the house, they had a hard time finding Ellen. Eventually, they were able to make their way to the master bedroom. On the bed, they found Ellen's dead body. Since Ellen was 85 years old, the police assumed she had died of natural causes. But then, the medical examiner performed an autopsy. He determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Ellen had been struck so hard that her skull had been caved in. The medical examiner could not pinpoint a time of death, but he thought she could have been dead a week before she was found. The police went back to the house and discovered that the walls in the master bedroom were splattered with blood. The police also figured out how the killer got into the house. There was an open window at the side of the house and a bucket beneath the window. There was also a cord from the window blinds that was hanging outside the window. The police think that the killer stepped on the bucket and then climbed in through the window. When the killer left, they dragged the cord with them, leaving it dangling outside the window. A major problem for the police was trying to find the murder weapon. Ellen was a hoarder, and there were many different items which could have been used to kill her. Unfortunately, they were not able to determine what the killer used to strike Ellen. The police have no idea who killed the 85-year-old recluse or why they killed her. Since Ellen was a hoarder who didn't allow people into her home, the police had no idea if anything was stolen from the house. Also, there were no signs of sexual assault. The police aren't sure if Ellen was targeted or if the crime was just random. The police canvassed the neighborhood looking for people who may have seen something unusual, but no one said they saw anything suspicious. The police said that they have had a few persons of interest, but they have never made an arrest. Ellen's daughter, who is also named Ellen, hopes that one day the case will be solved. She said, "Everybody deserves justice, and I pray for that for my mom." Number 2. Simon Dale. Simon Dale was born in March 1919 in Richmond, Surrey, England. As an adult, he followed in his father's footsteps and became an architect. In 1957, when he was 38 years old, he met Susan Wilberforce. Susan was 15 years younger than him, and she was blue-blooded. Her great-great-grandfather was famed slavery abolitionist William Wilberforce. Not long after meeting, they started dating. Susan's family was strongly opposed to the relationship, but after a short courtship, Susan and Simon were married. 2 years later, they bought a 17th century 30-bedroom mansion called Heath House. The mansion was completely run down. They purchased it for £2,000, which is equivalent to £47,368 in 2018, or about $60,000 US. They got the money from Susan's family trust. Shortly after moving in, Susan gave birth to a son. The couple went on to have 3 more sons and a daughter. However, the marriage didn't last. In 1972, 13 years after they got married, Susan filed for divorce. Susan claimed that Simon was abusive and his demands for sex were excessive and unnatural. She also claimed that Simon would wear women's clothes. She also said that one time he dug a grave on their property and told her he would put her in it. In July 1973, the divorce was granted and Susan moved on to a farm about 30 miles from Heath House. They were supposed to sell Heath House and split the profit, but Simon never really put any effort into selling the house. He basically became a shut-in. He used 3 rooms in the 30-room mansion. When Simon and Susan got married, Simon was half blind. Over the years, his eyesight only got worse. Despite his failing eyesight, Simon wrote a long manuscript about the history of England from 300 AD to 600 AD. He also had some weird beliefs about Heath House. For example, he thought it was built on the location where Camelot once stood. Camelot is the fabled court and castle associated with the mythical King Arthur. Simon also thought that the Holy Grail was buried in a cellar, and King Arthur's round table was buried under some bushes in the garden. After the divorce, Susan tried to move on with her life. On September 11, 1984, she got married to Baron Michael Victor Joseph de Semple, who was a member of a wealthy Russian family. When they got married, Susan got the title of Baroness. Their marriage was marred with problems. Notably, Baron Michael refused to consummate the marriage, and he slept alone in a tent on the farm, which Susan was renting. They got divorced in December 1986, but Susan kept the Baroness title and the de Semple last name. After the divorce, Susan and two of her children, Marcus and Sophia, moved into a cottage beside Heath House. They worked on the exterior of the house because they were hoping to sell it. They had very little interaction with Simon. Simon mostly kept to himself and worked on his manuscript. A woman named Giselle Wall was helping Simon with his manuscript by typing it. On September 13, 1987, Wall had finished typing up the manuscript, and she brought it to Heath House to show Simon. When Wall entered the house, she noticed a horrible smell. She went into the kitchen and found 68-year-old Simon lying on the floor in a circle of dried blood. It was clear he had been beaten in the head. The oven was still on, and there was burnt food inside of it. Wall called the police. The police came to the mansion and found no signs of a break-in or forced entry. They looked around the mansion and they did not find the murder weapon. The medical examiner determined that Simon had been struck in the head 5 times with a long, narrow, blunt object. He was struck a 6th time in the throat, which caused him to choke on his own blood. The medical examiner's best guess was that the murder weapon was a crowbar. Another possibility was that he was killed with a fire poker. The police looked around the mansion and discovered that a fire poker was missing. The fire poker appeared to be the only thing missing from the house. Nothing else appeared to be stolen, and nothing seemed to be disturbed. After Simon's body was discovered, the police went and broke the news to Susan and her 2 children who were living with her in the cottage. The 2 children were fathered by Simon. None of them seemed surprised, or even seemed to care that Simon had been murdered. The police interviewed friends of Simon, and they said they had strange encounters with Susan. For example, she would try to scare them away from the property. One time she threatened them with a crowbar. One of Simon's friends said that Simon was afraid of Susan. He said that Simon told him that if anything happened to him, Susan was responsible. The police searched the cottage where Susan was living. They found a crowbar which was dirty, but did not have any blood on it. They looked in Susan's car, and they found the fire poker that was missing from the mansion. It had been thoroughly cleaned. Something else the police noted is that the medical examiner thought that Simon was killed 2 days before his body was found. That meant he was probably killed on September 11, 1987. Had Susan remained married to Baron Michael, that would have been their 3rd anniversary. The police thought that they had enough circumstantial evidence, so in January 1988, about 4 months after the murder, Susan was arrested. Her and Simon's children, Sophia and Michael, were also arrested, but the charges were later dropped. Baroness Susan DeSemple went to trial in July 1988. She testified in her own defense. She admitted that she carried a crowbar with her on the mansion's property, but she carried it for her own protection. She said she was scared of Simon because he was abusive. She also admitted to being in Heath House on the night Simon was killed. She said when she left, Simon was still alive. Susan said when she left, she took the fire poker with her so she could clean it. She said that she had rushed home to watch an adaptation of an Agatha Christie novel on television. Susan testified that Simon was a nuisance, but she did not kill him. Her lawyer then pointed out that there was no physical evidence, like fingerprints or blood, that tied Susan to the murder. The trial lasted for 14 days, and the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. They acquitted Susan of both murder and manslaughter. She walked out of court a free woman. But the justice system wasn't finished with Susan. One thing the police thought was odd was that Susan lived in a small cottage that was furnished with antiques, fine art, Persian rugs, and expensive furniture. One police officer said it looked like a storeroom in the British Museum. They thought that this was odd because from what they could tell, Susan had no job or income. The police looked into Susan's financial records and they found something suspicious. Susan had an aunt named Lady Margaret Illingworth. Illingworth had been married to a cabinet minister and former postmaster general. He passed away several years earlier and he left his small fortune to Illingworth. In early 1984, Illingworth was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. At the time, Susan was living on the farm which she rented with 2 of her children, Marcus and Sophia. Susan invited Illingworth to come visit her. It was the first time that Illingworth had heard from Susan in over 8 years. Illingworth arrived at the farm on February 29, 1984. About 7 months later, Susan and Baron Michael got married. It turned out that they had paid for the wedding by selling some of Illingworth's jewelry. 3 months later, Susan put Illingworth into a nursing home. Illingworth lived in the home for 23 months and then passed away at the age of 85. The only people who attended her funeral were Susan and her children. The rest of Illingworth's family was not notified of her death. Illingworth, who was wealthy before she went to live with Susan, died £8,000 in debt. The bill for her funeral went unpaid. It turned out that Susan had been faking Illingworth's signature and she drained her bank accounts. The police also learned that Illingworth's will had been changed. Before she came to visit Susan, Susan and her family were not included in the will. But sometime after she arrived at Susan's farm, Susan and her family were made the beneficiaries. In total, it's believed that Susan stole at least £500,000 in money, stocks, shares, furniture, and jewelry from her aunt. Adjusting for inflation, in 2019, that was about 1.4 million pounds or 1.8 million US dollars. After the murder trial, Susan, her second husband, Baron Michael, and Susan's two children, Marcus and Sophia, were all charged with theft and forgery. Susan pleaded guilty in April 1990, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Michael, Marcus, and Sophia all pleaded not guilty. Their trial lasted 9 weeks. All three were found guilty. Michael was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Sophia was sentenced to 30 months in prison, and Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison. There are rumors that Lady Illingworth had 12 million pounds worth of gold bars, and Susan stole them and hid them somewhere. However, the police have never found any evidence that the gold bars existed. If Susan did steal them, the police have no clue where she may have hidden them. Baroness Susan de Semple adamantly denies killing her first husband, Simon Dale. The question is, if Susan didn't kill Simon, then who did? He was an eccentric recluse with very few friends. He had even fewer enemies. The case is officially cold, and it is one of the few unsolved murders in that region of England. Number 1. Marjorie Jackson. Lafayette Andrew Jackson was born in Bath County, Kentucky in 1863. He went by his initials, L.A. After L.A. completed his schooling, he went to work for a burgeoning grocery store chain called Kroger Grocery Store and Baking Company. In 1891, when L.A. was 28 years old, he left Kroger's and he started his own grocery store in Indianapolis, Indiana, called Standard Grocery. 2 years later, L.A.'s wife, Mammy, gave birth to a son named Chester. L.A. was an incredibly driven man, and his hard work paid off. 19 years after opening his first store, he had opened 19 more. Chester grew up in the business, and as an adult, he continued to work under his father. In 1931, L.A. was 68 years old, and he was still running the company. One thing that L.A. hated was criminals. He kept a revolver in his office, which was in the first grocery store he opened in downtown Indianapolis. L.A. once told a newspaper, "Criminals get off too easy nowadays. If anyone pokes a gun at me, I'm going to let him have it. Maybe I'll get killed, but I've got to die sometime. Even if I am shot, I can still shoot." His words would later prove to be prophetic. On May 27, 1931, Charles Witt and Lewis Hamilton, who were both 25 years old, walked into the store where L.A. was working. Witt and Hamilton both had criminal records, and they were wanted fugitives. They had met in prison. Witt had killed a sheriff in rural Texas in 1927, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He escaped after only serving 3 years. Hamilton had been serving time in the same prison for robbery. Hamilton was paroled in June 1930, and he was supposed to check in with his parole officer regularly. But he absconded not long after he was paroled. When Witt and Hamilton walked into the store, they were both wearing dark suits and hats. One was armed with a sawed-off shotgun, and the other had a revolver. In the store that morning was L.A. and Chester. Hamilton and Witt demanded the money. What happened next is unclear. It's possible that LA shot first, or it's possible that either Witt or Hamilton fired first. What is known for sure is that LA and one of the gunmen exchanged fire. After LA fired one shot, Hamilton and Witt unleashed a barrage of bullets at him. Then they ran from the store without getting any money. The store was just 2 blocks from the police station. An officer heard the gunshots and he ran to the store. He then got into a gunfight with Hamilton and Witt. The officer was hit and he fell to the ground. 2 other police officers happened to be in the area and they started firing at Witt and Hamilton. Witt and Hamilton managed to get into their car and they drove off. Minutes later, an ambulance came and took LA and the wounded police officer to the hospital. The officer survived, but LA wasn't as lucky. He had been shot in the head and the abdomen. He survived for 36 hours and then he was pronounced dead. Before he died, he told his surgeon, "They shot me down like a dog." Shortly after the attempted robbery, the police found the car that Witt and Hamilton were driving. There was blood inside of it, so the police knew at least one of the gunmen had been shot. At the time, the police did not know who killed LA. About a month later, on June 25th, the police pulled over a car just outside of downtown Indianapolis. The driver of the car was Charles Witt. They found a loaded gun in his car and discovered an unhealed bullet wound on his hip. He was arrested and brought to the police station. LA's son Chester and the police officer who was shot came to the police station. They both identified Witt as one of the shooters. That same day, Lewis Hamilton was arrested in Iola, Kansas. Chester traveled to Iola and identified Hamilton as the second shooter. Witt and Hamilton were both convicted of murder and sentenced to death. In November 1933, Charles Witt was executed via the electric chair. Lewis Hamilton followed suit 10 months later. He was executed in the same electric chair. After LA's murder, his eldest son, Chester, took over the company. Under Chester's leadership, the company grew exponentially and Chester became a very wealthy man. In 1932, Chester met a woman named Marjorie O'Connell while he was shopping at a five and dime store in Indianapolis. At the time, Chester was 39 years old and married. At 22 years of age, Marjorie was 17 years younger. While Chester shopped, he and Marjorie started flirting. It wasn't long before they started a romantic relationship. Chester justified the affair by saying his wife had been sleeping with other men. In fact, Chester said that his wife had gotten pregnant during a time when they had not had sex for over a year. Chester and his wife had no children of their own. In November 1933, Chester's wife moved out of their home and Marjorie moved in. However, Marjorie wasn't very happy with the relationship. Chester, like his father, was a workaholic. He was often at work early in the morning and frequently returned home around midnight. Marjorie spent most of her time alone. But Chester's hard work paid off extremely well. He had grown the company his father started by over tenfold. By 1947, there were over 250 standard grocery stores. That same year, Chester sold the company to the National Tea Company, which was later bought out by A&P. It's not exactly clear how much money Chester had after the sale of the company. Chester was afraid of the IRS, and he didn't trust banks. So he kept large amounts of cash hidden in his house. What is known is that he purchased $14 million in coal stocks, $5 million in municipal bonds, and he had $1 million in cash, treasury bills, and other investments. When accounting for inflation, that is nearly $230 million in 2019. After he sold the company, Chester, who was in his mid-50s, retired. In 1952, 5 years after the company was sold, Marjorie was out to lunch with a friend. Her friend mentioned that she heard that Chester had divorced his wife. This was news to Marjorie. It turned out that Chester had secretly divorced his wife 7 years earlier. Marjorie then went home and confronted Chester. A few weeks later, in July 1952, Marjorie and Chester were married in a small ceremony. In his retirement, Chester struggled with his mental health. He was convinced that someone was going to murder him. He got professional help, and by 1954, he seemed to be stable. That year, he and Marjorie purchased a 7-bedroom ranch-style house on Spring Mill Drive in Indianapolis. After moving in, Chester and Marjorie traveled around the world. But then, Chester's physical health started to fail. Around the same time, people started to notice that Marjorie was mentally unstable. Some of her family members said that, in hindsight, she may have had schizophrenia. At the time, they just assumed she was a free-spirited rebel. As Marjorie got older, her mental illness got worse, and she became incredibly paranoid. Then, on August 18, 1970, Chester, who was 77, died of natural causes. Marjorie and Chester had been romantically involved for 38 years and married for 18 years. Marjorie did not attend Chester's funeral because of her mental condition. She thought that Chester had been lying about who he really was. When Chester died, he left all his money in stocks to Marjorie. In total, over $7 million was deposited into Marjorie's bank account, which already had $1 million in it. Chester had been paranoid about banks, so there was also cash hidden all over the house that he shared with Marjorie. Exactly how much money was hidden in the house isn't known, but it was suspected to be millions of dollars. After Chester died, Marjorie started to leave the house less and less. If she did leave the house, it was only between noon on Sunday and dusk on Tuesday. Every week she would buy a dozen roses from a local flower shop. She would pay with a $20 or $50 Federal Reserve note that was printed in 1932. Because the notes were rare, they were worth 4 or 5 times more than their face value. She never accepted the change when she purchased the flowers. She would also buy way more food than she needed. Her kitchen became so full of food that she barely had room to cook. For example, it was not unusual for her to have 150 pounds of coffee, 200 dozen cookies, and 50 loaves of bread in her kitchen. Marjorie stocked up on the food because she thought that Armageddon was imminent. She was sure that God and Jesus were coming to earth to raise the dead. She would also buy jewelry and then gift wrap it. She added tags that read, "To God from Marjorie." Other gifts were for Jesus. Marjorie also suspected that demons and devils were trying to enter her home. So she put aluminum foil over the windows and over the vents. In 1974 and 1975, a trust officer named Herbert Biddle, who worked at the Indiana National Bank, was in charge of investing Marjorie's money. While Marjorie wasn't mentally well, her mind was sharp in other ways. She had an excellent memory, and she was very capable when it came to reading documents like financial records. Sometime in late 1975, Marjorie discovered that Biddle was embezzling money from her. On December 31st, 1975, Biddle quit his job at the bank, and he got a job with a law firm in Indianapolis. 9 days after that, Marjorie took a rare trip out of the house and went to the bank. She withdrew $500,000 in cash. Security guards loaded the bundles of cash into the trunk of her car. The huge withdrawal triggered a review of Marjorie's bank account. Bank officials then realized that over $600,000 was missing from her account. A week after her first withdrawal, Marjorie withdrew another $500,000 in cash, and then the week after that, she withdrew $1 million. The money was always loaded into grocery bags that were in her trunk. Officials at the bank, and even the district attorney and a judge, tried to discourage Marjorie from withdrawing all her money. They pointed out that it wasn't safe. They said that someone could break into her home and steal the money. They pointed out that she could very possibly be hurt or killed during the robbery. Marjorie was adamant that she wanted to keep the money at home. She said she was a free citizen and she was allowed to do whatever she wanted with her money. She said she wasn't worried about being robbed because she had 3 burglar alarms and God would protect her. The FBI then investigated Herbert Biddle for embezzlement. On April 15, 1976, Biddle confessed to stealing $625,000 from Marjorie. He would later be sentenced to 2 3-year concurrent sentences. After Biddle was arrested, Marjorie withdrew the rest of her money and closed out her account. Over 3 months, she had withdrawn over $7.8 million. Accounting for inflation, that is over $35 million in 2019. Marjorie was carefree when it came to spending her money. One day, she was driving her Cadillac. It broke down on the side of the road, and Marjorie had to call a tow truck. She told the tow truck driver that he could keep the Cadillac. She then went and bought 2 brand new Cadillacs, one to drive in the summer and the other to drive in the winter. She paid for both cars in full, in cash. On May 16, 1976, a neighbor of Marjorie's called the police. He had heard screaming coming from her home. The police arrived at her home minutes later. Marjorie told the responding officers that she was fine and told them to leave. The police had no reason to look around her home, so they left. Then, 7 months later, in December 1976, the prosecutor's office got an unusual phone call. The caller was a man who claimed to be a minister. The minister said that a man he knew talked to him about a woman who lived in Indianapolis who was supposedly a witch. The man had told him that the witch could bury a $1 bill in her yard and then come back the next week and dig it up, and it would be a $100 bill. The minister said that he knew someone was planning on robbing the witch. The minister also said that the man had told him that another pair of men had stolen $800,000 and some jewelry from the witch already. The prosecutor decided to do some investigating, and he learned that no one had reported $800,000 being stolen. But the prosecutor thought that the minister's story was too odd to at least not have some elements of truth to it. So he called the minister back, and he asked to talk to the man who told him about the witch. The minister set up the meeting for the next day. The man who talked about the witch was named Jerry Hornick. Hornick told the prosecutor that his brother worked at the flower shop where Marjorie Jackson bought her flowers. Hornick said that his brother told him that Marjorie was a wealthy woman who kept a lot of cash in her home. Hornick then told two of his friends, Wally Bergen and Douglas Green, about Marjorie, and they were the ones who robbed her of $800,000. Hornick said that he knew that they had robbed her because they gave him $20,000. After talking to Hornick, the prosecutor called the FBI. An agent called Marjorie and asked if anyone had stolen money from her. She told him that no money had been stolen. She said that if anyone did say they stole money from her, they were lying. The FBI agent and the prosecutor weren't convinced that no one had stolen money from her, so they kept investigating. They asked the police to arrest Green and Bergen, but they had problems tracking them down. They did locate Bergen's father, and the prosecutor had him testify in front of the grand jury in January 1977. He said that he was aware that his son had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from somewhere, but he didn't know from where. After the grand jury hearing, progress on the case stopped. There were two major roadblocks. The first was that the police couldn't locate Bergen and Green. The second roadblock was Marjorie Jackson. She denied that anyone had stolen money from her. The prosecutor was worried that if she was called to testify in front of the grand jury, she might say there wasn't a robbery, and the case against Bergen and Green would fall apart. Also, since Marjorie denied that there was a robbery and didn't want to press charges, looking for Green and Bergen wasn't the police's top priority. So the case became stagnant. Just before dawn on May 7, 1977, about 5 months after the grand jury hearing, one of Marjorie's neighbors called 911. Marjorie's house was on fire. The fire department arrived and they put out the fire. In the kitchen, they found the dead body of 66-year-old Marjorie Jackson lying in a pool of dried blood. The medical examiner later determined that she had been shot once in the abdomen with a .22 caliber rifle. The medical examiner said that Marjorie was probably killed 48 hours before her body was found. So the killer, or killers, returned 2 days after the murder to start the fire. The police concluded that the motive for the murder was most likely robbery. The police thought that the fire was set to cover up the robbery and the murder. The police found some irony in the fact that the killer, or killers, tried to cover up the crime by setting the house on fire. Since Marjorie was a recluse, no one probably would have realized she was dead for weeks or possibly even months. Investigators looked through the house and found some oddities. The dining room table was set with expensive dinnerware. The firefighters said that the table looked like the homeowner was hosting royalty. The table was surrounded with gifts that were for God and Jesus. It's believed that Marjorie had set the table to welcome God and Jesus. Investigators continued to look through the house, and they found piles of cash hidden throughout. They knew that Marjorie had withdrawn $8 million from the bank. She also possibly had millions of dollars stored away in the house before she withdrew the money. The police counted the money found in the house, and it was about $5 million. So at least $3 million was missing. The police immediately had a pair of suspects, Wally Bergen and Douglas Green. The police thought that since the pair got away with robbing Marjorie a year before, they did it again. But before the police could arrest Green and Bergen, another suspect was brought to their attention. In the days after the murder, the crime made headlines around Indiana, and it was the top story on each news broadcast. A car dealer who read about the murder took note of a man named Manuel Robinson who was looking to buy an expensive car in cash. The dealer said that he was suspicious because Robinson was already driving a car that was brand new. The police knew who Manuel Robinson was. At the time, he was on parole for robbery. The police brought Robinson and his girlfriend to the police station for questioning. They searched Robinson's body, and he was carrying several pieces of jewelry, and he was wearing some expensive rings. He also had over $2,000 cash in his pockets. Robinson's girlfriend gave the police permission to search their apartment. In the apartment, the police found some more jewelry and some expensive items that had been recently purchased. They also found more than $1.6 million in cash. The police confronted Robinson with what they found in his apartment. He admitted that he and a partner named Howard Willard, who went by the name Billy Joe, had robbed Marjorie Jackson. The two were an unlikely pair. Manuel Robinson was described as a hip black man who lived in the inner city, whereas Billy Joe Willard was described as an ignorant hillbilly by the deputy prosecutor. Willard had learned about Marjorie Jackson from Jerry Hornick. Hornick was the man who told Douglas Green and Wally Bergen about Marjorie. Willard had met Hornick one night at a bar, and Hornick told him that Green and Bergen had stolen $800,000 from Marjorie, and they got away with it. Not long after meeting Hornick, Willard met Robinson at a party of a mutual friend. Then they planned the robbery together. After Robinson identified Willard as his accomplice, the police went to arrest him, but he had fled. The sheriff in Marion County, where Indianapolis is located, was a man named Donald Gilman, who went by the nickname Diamond Don. Gilman was a millionaire. He made his money from running health spas and from gambling in Las Vegas before he was appointed sheriff. He had the nickname Diamond Don because he wore diamond rings and he wore a vest studded with diamonds. Gilman held a press conference and he told Willard to give himself up. He said that since it was public knowledge that he had over $1 million on him, bad people might be looking for him so that they could steal the money from him. Gilman said, for his own safety, Willard should turn himself in. The press conference was broadcast across the country. Several days later, on May 19th, Willard tried to purchase an RV in Tempe, Arizona. He wanted to pay for the $35,000 vehicle in cash. The RV salesman said he would get the RV ready for him, but it wouldn't be ready until the next morning. The salesman actually had the RV ready, but he decided to delay the sale because he was suspicious. After Willard left the sales lot, the salesman called the police. The police in Tempe knew to be on the lookout for a man spending a large amount of cash. The police interviewed the RV salesman, and they showed him a picture of Willard. The RV salesman said he was the man who tried to buy the RV. The Tempe police called in the FBI, and Willard was arrested the next day. When Willard was arrested, he was with his ex-wife, Marge Pollitt. She was arrested as well. The FBI asked Pollitt to cooperate with the investigation. Overcome with guilt, she agreed to help, and she led the FBI to a desert north of Phoenix. 2 FBI agents started digging in the area where she indicated. Buried 5 feet below the surface, they found 2 cardboard boxes with $1.6 million in them. Paul explained to the FBI that after Marjorie's murder, she and Willard drove to Phoenix. They traveled to Phoenix to meet the famous lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, who was working on a trial there. Supposedly, Bailey was the one who told Willard to bury the money in the desert. Bailey apparently suggested separating the money and burying it in 4 or 5 different places. He supposedly suggested splitting up the money and burying it in different locations in case someone demanded to know the location of the money. They could lead them to one spot where the money was buried, but they wouldn't get the majority of the money. Bailey adamantly denied saying this. Bailey said he told Willard he would represent him if he turned the money over to the authorities. Billy Joe Willard and Manuel Robinson both accused each other of shooting Marjorie. They both admitted to stealing money on May 5th, which was the night Marjorie was killed, and then coming back 2 nights later and stealing more money. Then they set the fire to cover up any evidence that they were in the house. Willard went to trial first in November 1977. He was found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was also sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and 10 years for transporting stolen money across state lines. His ex-wife, Marge Pollitt, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Manuel Robinson went to trial next, and he was ultimately found guilty of burglary, conspiracy to commit burglary, and arson. He was found not guilty of armed robbery and murder. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Several weeks after Billy Joe Willard's trial, Wally Bergen and Douglas Green were arrested for stealing $800,000 from Marjorie Jackson in May 1976. The police collected $263,000 that was still in their possession. It turned out that they had blown through most of the money in several months. They spent it on vacations, partying, and they went on several shopping sprees. Also, some of their friends found out that they stole the money and they blackmailed them. Their friends kept quiet in exchange for expensive cars. Douglas Green was also a victim of a home invasion himself. 2 career criminals had heard he stole money, so they stole $150,000 from him. Green also bought a farmhouse for $45,000 and then paid a contractor $20,000 to fix it up. Then a few months after buying the farmhouse, Green burned it down for the insurance money. But he only got $40,000 for the insurance claim. Green and Bergen pleaded guilty to conspiracy and burglary, and they were sentenced to 2 to 14 years in prison. Even the men who robbed Green of $150,000 were arrested and convicted, but they just received suspended sentences. Only one major mystery remained. It's not clear how much money was in Marjorie Jackson's house. Some people speculate that as much as $15 million was stashed around the house. Only about $8 million was recovered. That leaves about $7 million unaccounted for. The fire didn't cause too much damage, so the police don't think the money was lost in the fire. Instead, they think at least some of the money was stolen. They believe at least $1.6 million was stolen and is still missing. The police believe this because they have the serial numbers of the bills that Marjorie withdrew from the bank, and the bills with those serial numbers have never been found. So it's suspected that someone stole at least $1.6 million, but millions more could have been stolen. The police have no idea who stole the money. One theory is that someone broke into Marjorie's house and stole the money before she was murdered, and she simply didn't report it. After all, Marjorie didn't report Herbert Biddle's embezzlement, nor did she report the robbery committed by Douglas Green and Wally Bergen. Another theory about the stolen money comes from an investigative reporter named Don Devereaux. Devereaux has been nominated twice for the Pulitzer Prize. He started looking into the case in 2015 because he received a tip from someone who worked in law enforcement. He got the case file from the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act. Devereaux had previously filed 50 different Freedom of Information Act requests from the FBI for a variety of cases. The file on Marjorie Jackson's murder was much different from every other case file he has ever received. Part of the file had been destroyed and pages were missing. Devereaux thinks that the missing information implicates an FBI agent who worked in the Phoenix field office. 2 agents stationed in Phoenix were the ones who dug out the money that Billy Joe Willard buried. Devereaux pointed out that Willard's ex-wife said that F. Lee Bailey told them to bury the money in 4 or 5 locations. The FBI reported that all the money they found came from one location. So it's possible that at least one of the agents went to the desert and dug up more money that was buried in a different location. Or it's possible he skimmed some money from the one location where they found the money. Why Devereaux thinks that one of the FBI agents stole the money is because of something he found in the FBI's file on the case. Most of the time, when Devereaux would get a file from the FBI, the names of the agents that worked on the case would be redacted. But in Marjorie Jackson's case file, the name of one of the agents was not redacted. Devereaux said that if the name had been left unredacted once, it was possibly an accident. But the agent's name was left unredacted in the file 6 times. Devereaux thought that this was extraordinary. He thinks that someone in the Phoenix field office was suspicious of the agent and purposely left the name unredacted. So Devereaux looked into the agent's property and financial records. The agent's financial records show that sometime after the money was dug up in the desert, the agent transferred some money from a Swiss bank account to a bank account in the country of Netherland Antilles. The money was then used to buy valuable properties in the Phoenix area. The ownership of the properties was then transferred to an offshore holding company. Devereaux thinks that the agent was the owner of the holding company. Devereaux was never able to ask the agent about the money because by the time he started investigating, the agent had passed away. The name of the FBI agent Devereaux suspects of stealing the money has never been made public. Devereaux asked the FBI why some of the file was destroyed, but they did not give him an explanation. He thinks it is because they are trying to protect the reputation of the FBI agent. Some people think that Devereaux's theory is just a made-up conspiracy theory. Other people think it's a wild theory, but it's a plausible theory. They point out that the rest of the case was very strange too. Because of the colorful characters involved in the case has been compared to an Elmore Leonard novel and a Coen Brothers movie. A final theory is that not all the money that Billy Joe Willard buried was found. There could still be money buried in the desert outside of Phoenix. But those who go looking for the money should be warned. Some people think because of the tragedies connected to the money that the standard grocery chain fortune is cursed. The robbery at Marjorie Jackson's house is considered the largest heist of a residence in American history. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about exclusive podcasts. But that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching.